Did anyone figure out the answer to the question I put in the all-member email was who spoke to us about North Korea previously? No. It was a long time ago. He wasn't on the video. We weren't putting up videos at that time. It was probably about 10 years ago. And it was I think it was a Labour Party member, if I'm correct. And he was an MEP. He was at Brussels, and he led a group that was concerned about the situation at that time in North Korea. There was a famine, and there were food programs and political difficulties. He was a man called Glyn Ford, and tonight's speaker knows Glyn quite well. Indeed, it's my privilege to welcome Alastair Morgan, who's going to share his thoughts with us tonight. As you've seen, I won't go through his whole of his biography, but as you can see, he's worked not only with the Department of Trade and Industry, helping to boost Britain in Asia, but he's also worked as a diplomat. So he's multi-skilled, you might say, and he's also been performing those roles, not just in North Korea, but in Japan and in China, both countries which he knows so well. And of course, he served as our ambassador in North Korea. And after that, he's been on a United Nations panel that has been monitoring North Korea. And of course, he serves as a visiting professor at King's College London, where they benefit from his continuing expertise. So we can see the title that Alastair and I agreed quite a long time ago, wasn't it? It was last year we agreed it. I think it still applies, and I think we're in for a very interesting evening. Please welcome Alastair Morgan.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for your introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to join me tonight. And it's a great honor for me to be asked to speak and to join you for the question and answer session after I've spoken at the final event in this series of World Affairs Forum talks. And I must say that I hope that I will be able to help you end the series with a bang. And that wasn't something I used to say when I was in government working on North Korea nuclear programs, because we were very much trying to deter the Big Bang. I knew what to expect to a degree when I came here. The organization of the forum is absolutely superb. I've never been invited as a speaker to an event anywhere else where I've felt in such good hands from the speaker support. And it contrasts a lot with a talk I did a decade or so ago in Japan, where I was invited to give a seminar. And I went to the university having prepared a seminar for 10, 15 people. And as I was walking down the corridor to the seminar room, I asked how many people were going to be in the seminar room, and I was told 200. So I hadn't really prepared the right thing. Today I know roughly what numbers are going to be here, but it's still quite difficult to know how to pitch a talk. You're not the biggest audience I've spoken to. When I was in South China working in the preparations for the 2012 Olympics, I was invited by BMW, who were sponsoring an event, to join an event in a stadium. And there were thousands of people, but they hadn't really come to hear me. They had come for the pop concert that followed on afterwards. And it was a nerve-wracking event for me. I was speaking in Mandarin, and I'd been assured by BMW, who are very good with their technical side, that what I was going to say would appear on the teleprompter in front of me like this, and it didn't. But fortunately, I had learnt my speech in Mandarin, so I wasn't completely flummoxed. Tonight, I haven't learnt my speech, so if my notes vanish, we'll have to go straight to Q&A, which may be a relief for everyone. Just one point before I begin on another event, which was one that I gave just about 6 weeks ago, where it was interpreted into Japanese. And I started speaking, and I'd spoken for about 5-10 minutes when I was stopped because there had been a technical problem with the Japanese, and I had to start again. And that was fine, except that I never got to the end of my prepared remarks. And learning from that experience, I'm going to begin today almost at the end and start talking about the title, the use of the word Enigma, and talk about geopolitics. And then, if time allows, and I promise I won't go beyond 8:15 to make sure that there's plenty of time for question and answers. If time allows, I'll then go back and talk a little bit about some of the history which I might have used to introduce the topic, and more about my experience as ambassador in Pyongyang and life in Pyongyang. But I'm not too worried if I don't manage to cover that while I'm speaking to you, because we can cover it, I'm sure, in the question and answer session. As Bill said, we agreed the title about a year ago, which is a sign of just how well organized these events are. And I think it is still appropriate, though I would say that I'm not sure that really the DPRK, I tend to interchange Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, and North Korea. When I was working in the UN, I had to call it the DPRK, and it's become a habit. But I'm not sure really how much the DPRK itself is an enigma. There is certainly a huge amount about the DPRK, about North Korea, that is unknown, and it is one of the most closed societies in the world. When the DPRK saw the COVID pandemic emerging, it closed down its borders, and even some of the contacts that people had had with the DPRK were shut off. So there's a lot that is unknown, and as a result, a lot that is mysterious. And I think there are also things that are very anomalous and strange about North Korea, though I think they can probably be explained. But generally, what North Korea says about geopolitics and international relations, I think is not enigmatic. So it's very difficult to know exactly what the process is of North Korean decision-making, because they manage to control their information so much. They control the population, and they restrict access to government. So there is not much behind-the-scenes information about the decision-making of North Korea. And we don't know, for instance, to what extent Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader, the third generation of the Kim family ruling the country, actually takes the decisions individually or himself. And there's also a lot that we don't know about the life of the people in North Korea, because we don't have so much access to it. Much of what we know about how people live in North Korea, in fact, comes from interviews with the 34,000 North Koreans who have defected or escaped or left, and who now live in South Korea. But the flow of people leaving has slowed down greatly, so a lot of their information is out of date. Much of what we know about North Korea, we know from embassies in the country, international workers working for non-governmental organizations in the country, and most of those, no international workers there since 2020 border closure, most embassies closed now. But obviously we also know information from signals intelligence and from some human intelligence that journalists get from interviewing people within the country. But a lot of our judgments about North Korea are based on their propaganda, which is strategic communication, if you like, which is aimed at their own people, at controlling and directing their own people, but also at directing international affairs. And as I say, I don't think it's generally enigmatic. It may be hard to believe, some of it. It leaves you still with the need to interpret and to try to determine what risks and outcomes will be. So, for instance, very clear statements about a nuclear program, but you have to be making judgments about whether North Korea is ever likely actually to use its nuclear weapons and in what circumstances. One area that I think is enigmatic is in the North Korean philosophy of juche, and I think, frankly, enigmatic is a kind word for it. I think it's a load of tosh. But we can talk more about it. But juche is often, it's not a translation, but it's often used to refer to self-reliance or independence, and those are key concepts for North Korea, even though the meaning of juche is actually something different. And there's something of an enigma about the regime itself. Questions about how it has managed to survive since the post-war period through now, when other communist, socialist regimes, the Soviet Union, have collapsed. And I think there are answers to those questions, which I'm not going to give now. But of course, it's very anomalous to have a socialist or quasi-communist, almost Stalinist, it's not Stalinism, but it's similar to Stalinist, autocracy or dictatorship, which is also a hereditary system. I don't think it's an enigma, but it's an anomaly. But as I say, I'm going to go on straight to the geopolitics of North Korea, so that I put out my views on the North Korean international relations now, and we can come back to them, and I'll move on to other topics as time allows in the remaining 30 minutes. So, North Korea was originally created by the Soviet Union at the end of the war, when the peninsula was divided, and I can come back to the process of the division of the peninsula. And when North Korea was first created, and it was very much a child of geopolitics, because it was negotiation between the United States and the Soviet Union that led to the division of a peninsula that had not previously been divided, and which left the peninsula divided after Japan was defeated and the colonial status ended. But very initially, North Korea was absolutely a satellite state of the Soviet Union. The institutions that were set up followed a Marxist-Leninist, or particularly Leninist, model, and Kim Il-sung, the founder of the dynasty, was very much the Soviets' man. There is a mythology of Kim as a freedom fighter, and he was very much engaged in guerrilla conflict in Manchuria, leading troops in Manchuria, and then he went to Russia and joined the Russian army. But the mythology that the North Korea has of Kim liberating North Korea is not correct. North Korea was, the surrender of the Japanese was to the Russians in North Korea, and Kim was brought in after that point. And clearly at the beginning, the Russians thought that they would be able to control their man in North Korea. But it didn't work out like that. And from quite an early point, Kim Il-sung was starting to exercise his independence. And you saw that even in 1950, when you had the launch of the Korean War by North Korea, that it was Kim Il-sung who used his influence on Stalin and on Mao to get agreement to the launching of the Korean War. But North Korea is a very different place now, with a different philosophy, but there are still strong legacies from that period in the institutions of North Korea and in the way North Korea constructs its propaganda, for instance. During the period of the Cold War, when North Korea was in the Soviet bloc, or was in the Eastern Bloc, if you like, North Korea was very adroit still at actually maintaining its independence from the Soviet Union and from China, and from trying to negotiate the split between China and the Soviet Union during the period of the Sino-Soviet split. And you see that still in the way that the DPRK, North Korea, seeks to manage its relations with big powers. It is, and this comes back to the Juche point about independence, it does not wish to be beholden to big powers, controlled by big powers. It's only a country of 25 million people. It's highly impoverished, but still it wishes to maintain its independence. The extent to which it can actually be fully independent from China and others is limited, but that is its aim. Let me say a word about the objectives of the North Korean leadership, and that means Kim Jong-un himself, but other leaders supporting him in the Workers' Party of Korea. The key objective, in my view, and commonly held view, is the survival of the regime. That means the survival of the Kim family, the survival of the Workers' Party of Korea and its approach to the controlled society, and within the Workers' Party of Korea, the so-called monolithic leadership system, where you have, under Kim Jong-un, strong direction for everything in the country from the center. And those imperatives are stronger imperatives than the wish to serve the people, though like China, serving the people, or the people first, or the people as gods, is part of the ethos and the declared approach of the state. And I don't mean to suggest, despite the terrible human rights abuses, which I'm not going to talk about now, and despite the controls and restrictions, I don't mean to suggest that Kim Jong-un is necessarily a callous man and wishes the people of North Korea to suffer, but there are higher priorities than their material well-being. Let me flip through some key relationships. And I will start with the relationship between North Korea and the United States. And for much of the history of North Korea, North Korea has portrayed the United States as the primary enemy and as an existential threat to the existence of the DPRK. They see the United States as responsible for the division of the peninsula, responsible for the defeat, though they call it a victory, that was inflicted on North Korea in the fighting for in the Korean War, though of course the war after China entered the war ended with an armistice. And they have argued that the United States presents them with an existential threat from its nuclear capability and has a hostile policy aimed at the DPRK. And the United States repeatedly and regularly says that it does not have a hostile policy and that it wishes to engage with North Korea, but of course it wishes also to achieve the denuclearization of North Korea. And the North Koreans use the so-called hostile policy and threat from the United States as the rationale for the nuclear weapons program that they have developed, though the nuclear weapons program, they say, is not just for deterrence, but has a secondary purpose, which is also for war fighting should they be attacked. And there are big questions about North Korea's intentions towards the Republic of Korea and the south of the peninsula. All this approach towards North America, towards the United States, changed when I was ambassador in 2018, and it's not the first time it's happened. There have been other periods of rapprochement when you had the two summits with President Trump, and you had what looked like a process towards denuclearization. I think there are real questions about whether Kim Jong-un ever actually intended to denuclearize, but I think it is very much the case that he did intend to reset relations with the United States, to get sanctions against the DPRK lifted, to get a peace treaty or a peace agreement to end the Korean War. And with the failure of the second summit with President Trump in Hanoi, for whatever reasons, and we can talk more about that, that aspiration went away. It didn't go away immediately. There's an interesting process, or it was interesting for me, of how the DPRK's approach changed after Hanoi gradually, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But where are we now? We're clearly in a state where North Korea portrays America as an imperialistic, neo-colonial, aggressive hegemon, controlling, as it sees it, the puppet state of South Korea, and with a hostile policy that won't change. And the DPRK's position is that it will continue to build up its nuclear program and its the different capabilities within that, and that there is no prospect of denuclearization. And it is rebuffing every approach from the Biden administration to engage with North Korea in talks without preconditions. And I don't see that changing. I'd like to say something about the concept of multipolarity and the DPRK and multipolarity, and to go on from that to talk about the relationship now with Russia and with China. After the failure of the Hanoi summit in 2019, the DPRK, North Korea, didn't develop its new line, which is very much like its old line, pre-2018, in a vacuum. It, of course, developed it against what was going on in the world in the 2020 onwards. including the pandemic that I've already mentioned and the closing down that involved. But in particular, against the background of a much more contested world where if you like, the unipolar moment that had existed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the United States was clearly the only global superpower, though obviously China was a rising power. That was the world at the end of the 80s, in the early 90s. This is a very different position from now, where, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, but more widely, you see an extremely contested space between China and the United States, and you see, of course, Russian aggression. You had the invasion of Crimea in 2014, but you had the game-changing invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And all of this, the DPRK sees as highly advantageous for its own ability to develop its weapon systems, for maintaining its independence, and for progressing its political stance and its global presence, if you like. It has picked up the concept of multipolarity, particularly from the way it is used in Russian usage, in Russian propaganda or foreign policy statements. When the DPRK uses multipolarity, it does it in two ways, really. Partly in the sort of binary sense, like the Cold War, of actually bipolarity. There's the Western Bloc, led by the United States, and there's the anti-Western Bloc, the anti-imperialist bloc, championed now, as it sees it, by itself and by Russia. But it also has the benefit of multipolarity, which means it can avoid being reliant on a single overseas power. Turning to North Korea and China, North Korea-China relations have gone through many phases, and when the current leader, Kim Jong-un, became leader in 2011, relations with China, despite the closer than lips and teeth background of fighting together in the Korean War, actually also fighting together in Manchuria against the Japanese before that, and similar socialist origins, the relationships were really in a pretty poor state. And this was exacerbated by the decision by Kim Jong-un to murder his uncle, Jang Song-taek, who was one of his guardians and who was the closest senior North Korean official to China. And that happened in 2013, and it had a very dampening effect on relations with China. And probably there was no great love for North Korea from President Xi Jinping anyway, though he did visit North Korea as vice president before he became president. But in 2014, Xi Jinping made his first overseas trip to the Korean Peninsula, not to the DPRK, not to North Korea, but to the Republic of Korea. And he sought at that time to build closer relations with the conservative Park Geun-hye government in South Korea, with whom, in economic terms, China has a hugely greater relationship from a Chinese perspective than with North Korea. A lot has changed since then, but the nadir in the relationship between China and North Korea took place in 2016 and 2017, when I was ambassador, and so I saw it from inside North Korea. But when North Korea conducted 3 nuclear tests and a series of ballistic missile launches right up through intercontinental ballistic missiles, and China was concerned about this and joined with the United States and with Russia in sanctioning the DPRK in the United Nations, in the Security Council. And the DPRK shut down all contact with China, and was actually, the 2 countries were communicating through newspaper headlines. They were basically abusing each other, but China was warning North Korea, as North Korea's only military treaty ally, that if North Korea provoked a war, China would not come to its defense. The treaty allows for China to defend North Korea if attacked, but not if North Korea attacks. Anyway, in 2018, when North Korea reached out first to the Republic of Korea, then to the United States, China was determined to engage with North Korea, and North Korea also wanted to make sure that China had its back. So relations were restored in 2018, strategic communications, multiple summits, and in 2019, Xi Jinping going to Pyongyang. And the Chinese have been determined that that relationship will continue. China continues to be neuralgic about North Korean nuclear testing. Its main concerns are probably no war on the peninsula, no chaos on the peninsula, and only after that, no nukes on the peninsula. It would rather there were not North Korean nukes, but it is not going to risk again being cut off from strategic relations with North Korea. I might come back to that. In terms of the relationship between the DPRK and Russia, I spoke a little bit about the heyday at the foundation of the DPRK from the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, relations between the DPRK and the Soviet Union and then Russia were extremely bad under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a shock to the DPRK, and of course the DPRK wished to survive with its regime intact. And the ending of preferential trade with the Soviet Union and its bloc actually was one of the factors that precipitated the famine in North Korea in the late 1990s. Putin, in 2001, worked hard to restore relations with the DPRK. There was a new treaty. It's not a defense treaty, but a treaty of friendship and cooperation signed then. Russia has interests in North Korea with a warm water port and special economic zone in the northeast. But Russia could not compete with China in terms of economic linkages, and it was a quite low-key relationship really until we had the invasion of Ukraine, when the DPRK saw tremendous advantage to be had from supporting Russia in relation to Ukraine. And it was one of the very few countries that voted with Russia in the United Nations and has strongly supported Russia throughout. And we saw in 2023 a summit between Kim Jong-un and Putin, and we saw the defense minister Shoigu go to Pyongyang and attend a military equipment fair there. A lot of the emphasis on the relationship with Russia has been on the tactical side of it, the transactional side, and it is very likely that this is important for North Korea, providing weapons, ballistic missiles, munitions to Russia for use in Ukraine, which is important for Russia, contrary to all the sanctions which Russia agreed to in the UN Security Council. And in return, no doubt, North Korea is getting finance, getting support, food aid, tourists coming in, other linkages, some of which is only supposition, but we assume so. But I think there is a bigger strategic picture here in that North Korea really sees Russia and its invasion of Ukraine and its rhetoric about Western support for Ukraine and Western and NATO provocation of the war in Ukraine in the Russian argument, which of course we don't accept, as actually an attack on what I referred to earlier as US imperial hegemony. And there is an element of this that, my enemy's enemy is my friend. But I think it goes further than that, which is that the North Korea sees in the approach that Russia has taken in Ukraine, where Putin, talking about the history of Ukraine, talks about one people, but nevertheless has a hostile approach towards the government in Ukraine and is able to launch a so-called special military operation. This, I think, is comparable in the DPRK, in North Korean minds, to the position on the peninsula. And I've got 5 minutes left, and in those 5 minutes, I will say something about the North Korea and the Republic of Korea, the South Korea. And right from the start of the foundation of North Korea, Kim Il-sung saw the unification of the peninsula under his leadership and socialism or communism or Kim Il-sungism as a mission, and saw the initial Syngman Rhee government in South Korea as illegitimate. And that is why he launched the invasion of South Korea, though of course he claims that he was attacked and he claimed that he was attacked and was responding to it. And although in the 1990s and in other periods there was more rapprochement, in 1991 North Korea and South Korea joined the United Nations together. North Korea very reluctantly, and it was from that period that the United Kingdom started to recognize North Korea. Most of the time, North Korea has portrayed South Korea as a puppet regime, a neo-colonial entity controlled by the United States. In the 2000s, when you had Kim Dae-jung as a progressive president in South Korea, and you had the first summit, you had the start of dialogue. Actually, it went back before that, but you had dialogue about reunification on different models. And an aspiration for reunification. And you had periods when North Korea would recognize and speak politely of South Korea as if North Korea recognized the legitimacy of the South Korean government. And we saw the last of those periods, in 2018, 2019, when you had the progressive president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, welcoming North Korea to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, having summits with Kim Il-sung, reaching military agreements and other agreements, with Kim Jong-un, and discussion of how to progress that. With the failure of the Hanoi summit and the inability of the Republic of Korea to implement any of the agreements that were reached, the position started to deteriorate. And even before the progressive government of Moon Jae-in had left, you saw dramatic moves against the South, like the destruction of the office of the Joint Communication Office or Reconciliation Office on the border between the two states. But they went worse and worse with the change in 2022 to a conservative government in South Korea, and the level of hostility and risk has grown very considerably. And at the end of last year, for the first time, we saw the Kim Jong-un setting aside the plan for reunification, which his grandfather and father had supported, and saying that South Korea, the Republic of Korea, was a hostile state, and that even if they were one people, the Korean people, it was still the prime enemy state. And there's been a lot of discussion this year among commentators on North Korea about how great the risk is. Is Kim Jong-un preparing for war in the Korean Peninsula? He says he's not. He says he is preparing the capability for war, but the North would only attack the Republic of Korea if it is attacked. But of course, that's what he said in 1950, or the regime said in 1950. So that's not very comforting. Most American administration officials believe that Kim Jong-un is not preparing for war, but because the agreements, like the joint military agreement reached in 2018, have been torn up, and because of the stance of the Republic of Korea as well as North Korea, the risk of uncontrolled escalation, which could escalate ultimately to nuclear usage, is probably greater than ever. So that's where I'm going to end it, on that note of concern. And I haven't even mentioned what might happen if we have a change of administration in the United States and the return of President Trump. And there are many geopolitical issues to discuss, and I very much hope we'll be able to go into some of them in the question and answer session. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We do have microphones with Harry and with Zena. Put up your hand if you'd like to put a question. I'm going to power through as many of your questions as I possibly can. Now, we're going to start in an area that wasn't part of Alastair's talk, because he said he'd come back to it if there was time, but there was a lot of geopolitics to talk about. So I'll start with M. Dale's question. So he's wondering about language and the culture. So he's wondering whether Korean and Mandarin Chinese languages are mutually intelligible or closely related. Are there cultural contacts between North Korea and China? For example, do students from North Korea ever go to Chinese universities? And he wonders whether Korea, North and South, was ever an independent country before the Second World War. Perhaps you could deal with that. And so that's and I'll couple that with June's question, which is, what is life like for the people in North Korea under this socialist communist state? How does it work? Is it possible to have a normal life? And I'm going to come back to that later. So, culture and life.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to see so many questions. I'll try and answer the questions quickly. In terms of language, the Korean language is similar grammatically to Japanese, but in terms of vocabulary, has a very large Sino vocabulary, as does Japanese. So if it were still written in Chinese characters, a lot of it would be mutually comprehensible, or you could have a good shot at it. So if you look back at the early period of the foundation, when Korea did print its newspapers using Chinese characters, you can read it. But a Chinese person or a Japanese person who hasn't studied the Korean script Hangul will not be able to read it now. And they're probably mostly mutually incomprehensible, though you do recognize some words as being in common. There are also differences now between North Korean and South Korean, but they're as much to do with tones of politeness and the vocabulary that comes from with the ideology, rather than great linguistic change that makes it incomprehensible. There used to be quite a lot of contact between Chinese and Koreans. Obviously, I mentioned some of it from the period during the war and the fight for independence in China and in Korea. There is a community, now a small one, of ethnic Chinese who live in North Korea, and some of them came over to North Korea during the so-called Great Leap Forward in China in the 1950s, when there was starvation in China, and stayed. And there is a big Korean-speaking community in China, which has settled in the border areas. There were, when I was there were quite a lot of Chinese businessmen coming into Korea. I mean, hundreds rather than thousands, but quite a big stream through, and a lot of trading across the border, some of it legal and some of it illegal. And there were North Korean students in China and some Chinese students in North Korea, and there were a lot of North Koreans sent to work overseas, which is a form of modern slavery, although they wanted to get the jobs because they got much more money there than they would in North Korea, even though perhaps 80% of it was taken by the state. Those links have more or less come to a stop with the border closures in 2020 and the increasingly strict policing of the border to stop illicit trade, though it may open up again. And you may see more Chinese tourism coming in again in future. At the moment, we're seeing, unusually, Russian tourism coming in. What question did I not answer?
I think that's pretty good. Has he missed anything?
Normal life. Normal life there.
Normal life.
Normal life. Did you meet any? I mean, did you meet any
So living in
people?
Living in North Korea as a diplomat, we faced restrictions and constant surveillance, but we were free to move around within Pyongyang by bike, on driving our own cars, walking. And Pyongyang didn't just mean the center of the city, but rural areas within a perimeter. And we could travel to different places in Korea, some of North Korea, some of those without getting permission, some with permission, some where you had to take a member of the North Korean staff with you, you could meet North Koreans. So I had in the embassy North Korean staff. I couldn't meet their families, unlike the families of local staff in China or any other place where I've worked. That was not permitted. And you could have quite a lot of conversation with the North Koreans who worked in the embassy about daily life. So you got quite a sense about their own aspirations, their families, and so on. Had to be very careful about not giving sensitive information to them because they were reporting back, and had to be careful about not exposing them to risk. And that was, I felt as ambassador, particularly concerned not to expose North Koreans to risk when I was walking around through the town or the countryside, because as soon as I'd spoken to someone, the likelihood was that somebody who was following me, who I knew was there or didn't know was there, would come and question them about the conversation that had happened. North Koreans were, they were quite friendly. You could talk about various things. What is life like for North Koreans? In Pyongyang, when I was there, it is incredibly ordered, and you are part of the political economy of Pyongyang. It is your job to attend the rallies that the regime organizes, and to wave flags and to do things. And you are not just subjected to constant propaganda, you're expected to make it by attending these rallies and pledging sessions and so on. But for many people in Pyongyang, there was, at that time, 2015 to 2018, the standard of living was not too bad. There was food in the shops, the children went to school, went on to university. You could see the students actually were able to have a little bit of discretionary money that they spent on accessories and bags. If I walked through the street and listened to them, I could hear them chatting in informal ways. And I would hear a lot of North Koreans doing transactions. You would hear them talking about deals. So there's a huge amount of trading, and you had the markets, the formal markets that they could go to, and the informal markets where they could go and the frog markets that would hop around when they were disrupted, but where they could buy food and things. But in terms of the official discourse, they had no freedom of speech, no freedom of congregation, no freedom of religion. None of the constitutional freedoms that they're supposed to exist actually existed, and it was very difficult to tell to what extent they would dare to criticize or joke about the regime, though interviewing defectors suggests that to some extent they did. But I did not sense, I wouldn't know, but I did not sense that it was like the Eastern Bloc before the collapse of the Soviet Union, where you had so-called Moscow kitchens where people could discuss. And I didn't really get a sense of samizdat material going around, though undoubtedly people were watching videos that had come in from overseas. And there has been a huge crackdown on that, and particularly on South Korean material. Out in the country, things were much more Spartan. You could see that people were nutritionally challenged. There was very, very little light, though there were solar panels going around. People did not have clean water, but it was still an orderly society. I didn't think that North Korea was a failed state, like a war-torn state, even if it was a state that repeatedly failed its citizens in terms of what it allowed them and gave them.
You've talked about meeting the people, the extent to which you can meet the people down the hierarchy. Sean King's got a question about up the hierarchy. So he wonders whether you've met Kim Jong-un and And you might want to comment whether, if you haven't, who you have met, and what observations you could make about his character.
So I was quite close to Kim Jong-un on other occasions, and we have looked each other in the eye, but I'm not sure that counts as a diplomatic encounter, because I would go to events where he would speak or do an opening, and you could actually get some sense of his character and behavior and how people reacted to him from those occasions. He could be quite charismatic, but he could also be completely detached at times. And I saw that from not just from his personal appearances, but from, for instance, a television appearance on the night that his stepbrother, or half-brother rather, was killed, presumably at his behest. He sat flicking through a long speech. It was a commemorative event for the death of his father, but his mind was elsewhere. My predecessor as ambassador met him, and I think kind of regretted it because he was grinning and shaking his hands, and this picture was then blown up and put in the Museum of Friendship, where he didn't really wish to be commemorated in that way. But at the time I was there, Kim Jong-un was not meeting any diplomats. In 2018, that changed, first with meeting the Cubans and then meeting the Chinese intensively. And whatever the eventual outcome, and it was an unhappy outcome, of the summitry, with nothing achieved in terms of the summits with the US, there was a big change in terms of knowledge of Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un was almost an unknown character before 2018, and the fact that the Chinese in particular were able to spend hours with him, but the Americans too spent quite a lot of time, meant that they had a much greater ability to judge him, judge his knowledge, his level of knowledge, his courtesy, his respect for other people, and to get a sense of that he was not mad. Is he mad or bad? Even if he was unsuccessful, and we're still in a very dangerous place. Most of my contact was with officials who were at the level of Director General or Vice Minister, and some of them are quite senior figures now. Chae Song-hee was a vice minister when I was there, and she's now the foreign minister, and a particularly influential one of the few women in a position of power who isn't a member of the Kim family. My own contacts actually became more limited as things went on in 2016 and 2017, because the British government closed down its programs. It ended a British Council program which had teachers teaching in universities in North Korea, which was a terrific program that had run from 2000 until 2017. It ended because we couldn't guarantee the security of the teachers anymore, that they'd be able to get out of the country. It ended the small humanitarian projects that we were given, and there was no prospect of trade or economic contact. So there was no point for North Koreans in areas like education or so on to come and talk to me anymore. So I actually had fewer contacts than previously. But some of the key, there are very few occasions where I felt that, there were lots of occasions where I felt I was putting in messages from the British government and saying things to North Korea that they would not hear directly from their embassies overseas. And I hope that some of those would filter up, including to Kim Jong-un. But there were few points where I felt that I knew I had made a decisive impact with a senior figure. One was at the beginning of 2018, when I had a chance to meet the foreign minister, Ri Yong-ho, who had actually been the North Korean ambassador in the UK originally, and talked to him I told him that the US were ready to meet, willing to meet. And I didn't know it, but he'd actually been given the same message via a UN official who visited with a message from Trump. And I think that made a difference towards the opening up in 2018, was one factor among others. But generally, I think I reinforced the message that it was, even if the North Koreans were right, that the US would not attack them, because they, at the same time as arguing that there was an existential threat from the North Americans, the Workers' Party said they will never attack us, and they felt they could develop their missiles with impunity. Even if you are right, you are not right that you can run a parallel program where you develop nuclear weapons and you develop the economy. You will not be able to do it. You will not be able to get sanctions lifted in the way you expect. And that was a message I repeated, and I think I would repeat it again. And I think it was heard, even if it wasn't acted on.
Back to the people in North Korea, and you part answered this, but briefly might want to add a thought. Philip Stenning is wondering whether the North Korean regime sees any benefit from allowing North Korean citizens to study at overseas education institutions, particularly universities, or is this absolutely prohibited?
When I was ambassador, and my predecessors before us, we ran the British government's Chevening Scholarship program in North Korea, as we did in other places. And actually, before my time, we even had two, they insisted on sending pairs rather than individuals, two North Korean students, I think went to Cambridge. For 2 years, and this is repeating a pattern that my predecessor had as well, we ran the program in North Korea. We made special allowances because the North Korean students were not able to access the internet to get the information to do it. We lined up, and in the last year that I did this, the University of Central Lancashire, a professor there, went out of her way to arrange a program for North Korean medical students. The North Korean students wanted to go, the education officials would have liked them to go, but in the end, 3 years running, we were told they couldn't go. And the reason they couldn't go was actually central and security, that the regime, the security aspect side of the regime, did not trust students to go overseas to study in the UK, particularly locations away from the surveillance of their mission in London. The regime still sees value in technical links with overseas universities and encourages scientific collaboration with universities in China and elsewhere. Some of this is now contrary to UN sanctions, but they wish to build up their own university capability in technical areas, and they do see benefit in overseas study if they can do it, but they don't trust. Centrally, they don't trust their own citizens.
There are a lot of questions here about opposition or the absence of it, presence of it, and you've partly answered this, but I think since so many people are asking, I'll read out the questions and you see if there's anything you'd like to add. So Sid Goodwin, how easy is it to judge whether there is any serious opposition to the supreme leader? Do you know if the government, Joe Sexton, do you know if the government treats any opposition in the same way as Putin does, like poisoning rather than imprisonment? And you might want to expand on that. Jane Sharman, is there any internal resistance to the regime? So those are all on the same track. Brendan Walsh puts it slightly differently. He wonders whether you can give any insight into how the general population view the regime and whether that's changed over time. Would anyone know whether it's gone through ups and downs in anti-Kim feeling, or is it totally flat?
the answer is it's very difficult to know these the answer to the question. I mean, it is really difficult to judge. It is one of the things that, as ambassador, I was expected to feed in views about, though I think there was a recognition that it was difficult. And there are famous cases where British ambassadors and British missions have failed to spot resistance to regimes. And Anthony Parsons, who was the ambassador in Tehran, and his embassy failed to spot the coming fall of the Shah, and actually wrote about it and looked at why they didn't do that. There have been periods in the past where there have been thought to have been military revolts, and I didn't see any of that, and I probably wouldn't have seen any of that. But you do see the regular rotation of the purging, which is not necessarily brutal purging, people taking people out of jobs, moving them back in again, of leadership of units to get to maintain control from the supreme leader. What you do see, or I saw as a diplomat, was a degree of cynicism and a degree of civil disobedience. I actually watched well, I didn't stand around and watch, but I went past and saw a would-be trader who had been stopped by a policeman assaulting the policeman. The policemen are pretty low in the order of the security forces in North Korea. There are other more frightening branches. So you do see that. I've seen women quite vociferously calling out people in authority about restrictions on them which they dislike. I remember going to a parade where walking behind two women going to parade, young students, and listening to what they were saying and realizing that they were playing mind association football in Korean, where you link the words with the next ones. So they were completely detached from it. And I also remember going to a parade where a young student, there was a control van going through telling people how to behave, and that the honored guests were about to come through and they should applause and do something. And then after the van had gone through, one of the students mimicked what was being said by the van. That's a degree of cynicism, but it's not civil disobedience and certainly not revolt. Interviews with defectors, which I referred to before, there is a difficulty with the interviews of defectors in South Korea because they've all gone through an institution called Hanawon, which tends to shape their answers after they've gone through it. But there is a lot of evidence from interviewing these people that there is criticism. I don't believe that Kim Jong-un is more unpopular than Kim Jong-il, though it is quite likely that Kim Jong-il was more unpopular than Kim Il-sung. And is it getting worse? The degrees of restriction are getting worse. And the whole approach to South Korea probably reflects concern in North Korea about the attractiveness of South Korea for the North Korean people. In terms of the predictions I put back, I said that it was very hard to see how any civilian group or even military group would coalesce to have a putsch against Kim Jong-un. And if you did, it's quite hard to see what would come next. So we were not expecting in the British government the collapse of the North Korean regime. And I think Kim Jong-un is probably more of a risk to himself in terms of his health, though I don't think he's about to drop dead, then others are a risk to him.
A couple of questions about dynasty, succession. First one, I think you probably don't need to answer, but I thought it was quite amusing. Jeff Elliott, can the Speaker envisage any Western nation allowing itself to be ruled by a hereditary head of state? And Joy is asking, do you have any idea as to who might succeed the Supreme Leader?
So in terms of the hereditary head of state, I mean, there is, of course, a great deal of difference between between a constitutional monarch as we have one now in King Charles III and an absolute monarch as we used to have in Henry VIII, and even that wasn't quite absolute. But in terms of the dynastic succession in North Korea, to some extent, I do think that actually there is with Kim Jong-un a modeling on the behavior of heads of state who may be monarchs, but also other heads of state. So the introduction of his wife, Ri Sol-ju, who went with a lot of events to him, with him to a lot of events, who was quite stylish, and I got into terrible trouble for saying quite attractive once when I reported something back to the Foreign Office. It was thought to be not proper, but I think in terms of Kim Jong-un's sense of his wife, he probably sees her as quite attractive. And I do think actually that's partly modelled on how other ruling families, whether they're elected or hereditary, behave. In terms of the succession, I don't know. I mean, what is quite clear is that Kim is signalling that there is another generation, and in terms of putting forward his daughter, who may or may not be called Jue, it's quite plausible that she might succeed. I think that one of the reasons for giving attention to her is actually to modulate the attention given to Kim's powerful sister, and there was, of course, a lot of speculation about whether she might take over. And I think showing that there is, still a young teenager, but a daughter who can be expected to reach majority while Kim is still alive, who is already being trained, actually limits the role of his sister. Poor girl being put in this position, but she seems to be enjoying it so far.
She hasn't been killed yet.
I think the danger of being a half brother or a different branch of the family is very different from being in an immediate blood relative. Though there are reportedly other Kim children who we don't see and don't know about. I was once asked by somebody working for Japanese intelligence how many children Kim had, and I said I had no idea. He was rather shocked. He thought I ought to be spending my time rooting them out.
Can we turn to the question of there's a few people here wondering about it sounds like a bit of a basket case, right? So I want to understand it economically. So a series of questions, answer them in one go. So Bob Winter puts it this way: where does North Korea's money come from to develop the nuclear weapons? Chris Nibbs, apart from Russia, does North Korea trade with anybody? And Harry and Zena, our two students, do you ever see a scenario where North Korea is forced to open up economically because of the challenges that it faces, despite the challenge that might have for the survival of the regime?
So I can't remember what the ratio is between the DPRK gross national product and the Republic of Korea gross national product. Up until the 60s, North Korea had the larger gross national product and was thought to do so, but it's now 80-1 in favor of the ROK, or some large figure, though this is all supposition. And in many ways, the North Korean economy is indeed a basket case, and more of a basket case than it was even 5 years ago. And this is in part the result of sanctions, but it is more to do with the economic choices and controls imposed by the regime, and the inhibition this places on the competence and willingness to trade of North Koreans. The North Korean economy can never be self-sufficient, entirely self-sufficient. And in terms of nutrition, North Korea can't be self-sufficient for geographical reasons. It just doesn't have enough flat land to grow food on. So it is always going to be dependent on a degree of trade, whatever it states that, or it faces starvation. And it's very difficult to know to what extent there is actual starvation at the moment. I mean, we know that there was very severe starvation in the 1990s. In the period since that, when people were nutritionally deprived, and they didn't have enough proteins and so on. But basically, there was not starvation. There was a shortage of food that led to stunting. And the economy was also growing. With the closure of the borders in 2020 and the reassertion of central control, a lot of the trading economy has probably been shut down. Clearly, North Korea has some economic competence. I mean, you cannot mass produce or ballistic missiles without a degree of economic capability. And this involves factories with machine tools, quite sophisticated technologies. It also involves being able to access components from overseas, even now. In terms of who North Korea trades with, before the opening up with Russia, only a very small proportion of North Korea's declared and licit trade. North Korea publishes no trade statistics itself, or none of any value. It's all mirror statistics from the trading companies. About 90% of North Korea's trade was with China. But partly the reason why there was such preponderance of trade with China, apart from the fact that you had the land border and close maritime links as well, was the shutting down of other trading partnerships. So you used to have trade with the Republic of Korea, but it was shut down after the sinking of the Cheonan naval vessel in 2010, and then you had the closure of the Kaesong Park as well. You used to have trade with Japan, and probably the ethnic Koreans in Japan remain a source of income for North Korea, despite the controls on that. But Japan has shut down the trade. You used to have trade with Singapore, but it's been shut down. You used to have more trade with Southeast Asia. So North Korea would trade with others if it was permitted, and it has illicit trade around the place. Where does it get the money for its missile program? By allocating a very, very large amount of the discretionary funds available to the regime, and by earning, and also you should, the cost of these programs is very hard to estimate. If you don't pay anybody, then that reduces your labor costs, and other costs are reduced in the same way. But they raise money through cybercrime, through attacking fiat currency banks, but also cryptocurrency, through illegal export of minerals, which is all sanctioned, but which there is still trade going on, through trading activities overseas, where you have a sort of ledger system that gets the money back into North Korea, or gets credit back into North Korea, and now, very likely, through payment for missile exports to Russia, probably to Myanmar, and other ways.
Just one more point, just to finish off on this sort of the nuclear aspect. Bruce Beard's wondering just how independent is it? You've dealt with the financial side, but are they totally independent and capable, as far as you know, on developing the bomb, on the delivery system, and the power generation, and everything else? Have the experts told you whether they have total competence within their borders?
The North Koreans, of course, claim to have total competence within their borders. It is easy to point. I mean, and I worked on this when I was at the panel of experts in the UN. And if you look back through previous panel of experts reports since 2009, you can see the documentation of where technology and equipment has been derived from, and you can point to some very specific derivation from overseas of equipment, transporter erector launchers from China, for instance, and missile engine technology, possibly in the past from Ukraine, but from the Soviet bloc. It is not clear what technological support, if any, North Korea is getting from Russia now, say. I don't know the answer to that. Within the country, they almost certainly are able to do the planning and development and testing of nuclear devices, miniaturization of nuclear devices, the development of ballistic missiles, changes to the propulsion system, the guidance system, development of hypersonic systems. Very, very sophisticated development, which they can all do in country. But they continue to try to obtain, including through cyber hacking, technology from overseas, including designs, and the ballistic missiles which they have provided to the Russians, which are now being used on the battlefield in Ukraine. You can see from the debris that has been collected that they continue to contain a large number of components which are sourced from overseas, though many of the components are dual use, and so they're readily available on markets. So North Korea continues to be able, either has a very good stockpile or continues to be able to source the componentry it needs. And it's not looking just for components, but for manufacturing equipment, for new materials, and so on.
I'm going to finish in a sort of geopolitical area. And Mary Potter says, well, thank you. You've explained how North Korea what do they think about South Korea. But she wonders what the view of South Koreans is of North Korea. And alongside that, Adrian Cartwright's saying, well, just how valid is North Korea's fear of the USA? Because how large is the contingent of the US armed force presence in South Korea, and for that matter, in Japan and the surrounding area? So I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
There may well be people here who know South Korea much better than I do. I mean, I've spent a certain amount of time as ambassador. One of my roles as ambassador was not just in country and with London, but actually visiting Five Eyes countries, so Australia, New Zealand. I didn't go to New Zealand, but Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, Republic of Korea, Japan, and I would have meetings in China as well, where I would meet people from analysts up to head of government. And so I have spent time in the Republic of Korea, but I've never been posted there, and I've never worked there. South Korea is a very divided society, with the present conservative administration having actually slightly President Yoon's popularity is growing, but it's low popularity, and there is a strong division of opinion between the progressives and the conservatives. Most on a generational basis, the number of South Koreans who are interested in the idea of unification with North Korea is shrinking. So that the generations that experienced, and I didn't answer that question about was there ever an undivided peninsula. Yes, centuries ago there was an undivided peninsula, and in a sense under Japanese colonial rule it was undivided, but obviously not independent. But the number of South Koreans who've experienced the division is diminishing all the time. There is a definite tit-for-tat element in the policy positions and statements of North Korea in relation to South Korea, and South Korea in relation to North Korea under the current Yoon administration. I think that the threat that North Korea faces from the United States does not exist, and I think the North Koreans I don't think the leadership really believe it exists. They do not believe that the United States is seeking to overthrow the regime. Certainly not under the Biden administration. Talk to John Bolton, and you might get a different view from him. The risk of because the current South Korean government is determined to respond like for like plus to any provocation, as they call it, from North Korea, means that the risk of escalation of an incident and the likelihood of incidents with the ending of the military agreement is greater than before. The risk of escalation is considerable, and US control over South Korea is probably less than it was. The 23,000 US troops, which President Trump, when he was president, spoke regularly of removing and had to be discouraged from removing, and that might be one issue that would come up again if he became president. They are a trigger force. There is no, the 23,000 American servicemen is not an aggressive force in South Korea. There was a time when the US did have tactical ballistic missiles, tactical nuclear missiles located in South Korea, but they were removed. The definition, one of the reasons why it's impossible to satisfy North Korea on removing the hostile policy is because it is of almost infinite extent. So, in terms of a North Korean definition. So, first of all, they might talk about nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula. Then, there's the question of whether what there is in Guam. Then there's the forces in Japan. And then actually you've got intercontinental capability in the United States. So as long as that capability exists, North Korea can claim that it is subject to a hostile policy from the United States. I would just say that there is a real sense in which the United States, through its engagement with the Republic of Korea is acting in part as a restraint. And this was certainly recognized decades ago. I'm not so sure how much it is recognized now. But I can say from meeting recently South Korean officials and from what is reported from South Korea, there is still a very considerable sense in South Korea that because of the threat from North Korea, they ought to develop their own nuclear capability. And the US seeks to restrain this. I think it would be a terrible thing. But I think the risk is really there from the conversations that I've had. But the things like the Washington Declaration and the nuclear consultation talks and making clear that there is extended deterrence is about restraining South Korea as well as making sure that there is deterrence from North Korea. And it is the actions of the DPRK and perceived threats from China that has led, for instance, to Japan committing to spend 2% of GDP on defense and acquiring offensive capability missile systems, though it says it will only use them in defense. I'm in no doubt that this is a response to the actions of the DPRK and China, but the DPRK and China may not see it like that, and I know that the Russians present it as Japanese militarism.
Firstly, to the audience, thank you so much for all the questions tonight, and they were many and varied, and as happened throughout this season, you've been brilliant putting our guests up against the wall and throwing all sorts of tricky, googly questions to them. I think we've had a wonderful evening with our guest. How wonderful it is to meet someone who's been there on our behalf and has been in close contact with the regime. That came through strongly in the talk that we've received from Alastair Morgan, and of course in all the answers that he's offered for your various questions. I think it's been a fascinating, I don't know whether the Enigma has been removed. I think we've opened the box and we've looked at it much more closely, and I hope you'll leave this season wiser, possibly a little bit sadder, but it has been a wonderful end to the series, and so I'm deeply grateful to Alastair Morgan for coming here tonight.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you. Much appreciated.